Wars and battles have always been part of human history. But pinpointing the origins of purely military equipment in material culture is surprisingly tricky. A spear, for example, could serve both as a weapon and a hunting tool, while stone axes or knives were often used for everyday tasks. Interestingly, the first piece of purely military gear might not have been a weapon at all. Believe it or not, the shield takes that title. Even indigenous peoples of Africa, Australia, and North America used shields, and their material cultures changed very little over thousands of years. Pinpointing when humans first started using shields is difficult, though. Materials like wood and leather, commonly used for early shields, don't last long. However, ancient cave paintings suggest that shields might date back to the Stone Age. By the Mesolithic era, the dagger had emerged. Its blade was often crafted from flint or obsidian, or even bone with grooves for sharp stone inserts. Later, during the early Metal Age, daggers were made from copper and eventually bronze, laying the groundwork for all blade-based weapons. One evolution of the dagger was the sword, but daggers themselves never disappeared. Evolving over time, the dagger has made it to the present day and is actually more relevant now than the long-bladed weapons that have faded into history. Few people realize, though, that the dagger played a role in sending shields to the scrap heap of history, which is what we'll be discussing today. If we believe Plutarch, the phrase, "with your shield or on it," was a rallying cry among ancient Spartans. The large scutum shield was an iconic part of a Roman legionary's equipment. Vikings used smaller round shields in battle, and the diversity of medieval knightly shields is a vast topic in itself. But by the late Middle Ages, shields were falling out of favor. While firearms are often blamed, the reality is more complex. Starting in the 5th century, Europe entered what we call the Middle Ages. Despite the period's association with grand and gloomy cities, actual urban centers were rare until the High Middle Ages. They didn't hold much sway over political affairs either. Feudal lords, the ruling class of medieval society, were scattered across their realms, living in fortified homes or castles. They essentially ruled over their territories and profited from the peasants who worked their lands. In today's terms, a count, baron, or duke lived in what we'd call the countryside. The differences mainly came down to the size of their castles and the number of servants, peasants, and lands they controlled. To a modern urbanite, medieval Europe was essentially one big backwater. Until the 12th century, later in some places, most towns had populations of just a few thousand people. As mentioned earlier, towns played little political role, functioning mainly as hubs for craftsmen and merchants, essentially permanent fairs. But as it turns out, concentrating craftsmen and merchants in one place creates a money economy. This allowed towns to grow, assert their independence, and influence politics, despite originally being located on feudal lands. By the High Middle Ages, towns evolved into something closer to our modern understanding of the term. This led to changes in the feudal system, as nobles increasingly traded their remote castles for city palaces equipped with, as we might say today, modern amenities. And here, you might wonder, what does this urbanization have to do with shields and daggers? Actually, quite a lot. Feudal lords weren't just the wealthy elite, they were also the warrior class. Even kings weren't above swinging a sword in battle. But life in cities brought new challenges. On one hand, there were always thieves and bandits. On the other, cities were full of fellow nobles, often with big egos, complex personalities, and conflicting interests. This led to the rise of a lighter sword for civilian use, known as the rapier in many languages, and the proliferation of dueling. The phenomenon was so widespread that during the 20-year reign of Henry IV of France, an estimated 10,000 people died in duels. Clearly, a sword, or later a rapier, was a deadly weapon, especially against an unarmored opponent. But a person with some kind of personal protection would have had an advantage. Starting in the 13th century, France saw the spread of a small hand shield called the buckler, typically no more than 40 centimeters in diameter. By the 14th century, it had reached England and Germany. People carried it on a strap, a hook, or even attached it to their sword hilt. Unlike larger shields, the buckler didn't offer passive protection, but it was light enough to allow quick movements, parry blows, and even land some hits of its own. A distinct fencing style, called sword and buckler, emerged. But don't think this was just a civilian accessory. On battlefields of the late Middle Ages, heavily armored cavalry, clad first in chainmail and later in full metal plates, rendered traditional infantry, armed with one-handed weapons and shields, largely obsolete. This era saw the rise of halberds, pikes, and two-handed swords. By the 15th century, handheld firearms also started gaining traction. Alongside these developments, many infantry soldiers carried a buckler, a small shield, along with their two-handed weapons, probably as a just-in-case measure. Larger shields, meanwhile, were primarily used by cavalry and, interestingly, crossbowmen. Now you'd think that if shields were falling out of favor on the battlefield due to the effectiveness of heavy cavalry and later firearms, the buckler would still remain practical in cities. But no. By the 15th century, a new style of sword with an elaborate guard, basket-hilted swords, began their rise to prominence. These swords featured hilt designs that protected the hand, allowing the wielder to deflect strikes on the guard itself and even strike back with the hilt's structure. And then, someone, probably a Spanish blacksmith, had a clever idea. It's worth noting that the kingdoms in what is now Spain and Italy were trendsetters in blade design and fencing techniques during that time. Why bother carrying a metal dish like a buckler when you could create an elaborate guard and add a short blade to it? Essentially, this weapon could block an opponent's blade like a shield and also strike when needed. Thus, the parrying dagger, or daga, was born. By the way, the word daga in Spanish and Italian simply means dagger. These weapons were typically about half a meter long and often featured a hefty triangular steel guard. In Spain's fencing tradition, destreza, the combination of rapier and parrying dagger, became key. The idea was straightforward. The rapier in the right hand delivered strikes, while the dagger in the left hand parried and defended. In essence, the parrying dagger replaced the shield as a defensive tool. This weapon came in many forms, but they can generally be grouped into two categories. The first includes daggers with highly developed guards, while the second encompasses sword breakers. Sword breakers, popular in Germany, were folding trident-like daggers that opened via a spring mechanism when a button was pressed. But let's clear up a myth. Those folding blades don't actually open. While this theory was once popular, experts have tested it and debunked it. Another type of sword breaker had a solid blade with specialized notches. In Western literature, it's often called a main gauche or left-hand dagger. Despite the intimidating name, tests show that breaking a proper blade with such a dagger was nearly impossible. Instead, its primary purpose was likely to catch an opponent's blade in the notches, immobilizing it, and providing an opening to strike with your own weapon. In combat, every second counts, and these sword breakers could create the critical moment needed for a strike. With enough skill, they could even disarm an opponent by twisting their weapon out of their grasp. It's worth noting that while movies often show heroes wielding two swords, this wasn't particularly effective in reality. In his 16th century fencing manual, Giacomo di Grassi noted that even when using two full-length rapiers, one should be for attack and the other for defense. Attempting simultaneous attacks with both blades, he argued, was risky and more likely to backfire. Daggers with advanced guards and sword breakers became a more versatile replacement for the buckler. However, by the 18th century, the age of dueling fever was coming to an end. The nobility had cooled their tempers, likely due to widespread bans and harsh punishments for duel participants. Duels became more civilized, often ending with the first draw of blood. Along with these changes, the daga disappeared from the duelist's arsenal.